The flash flood hit the Montana Rockies with a violence that 68-year-old Henry Barrett had not witnessed in 45 years of living in these mountains. The spring melt had come early and fierce, sending walls of brown water cascading down the ravines, tearing through creek beds that had been dry since last autumn. Rain hammered against the windows of his log cabin with such force that Henry could barely hear the radio crackling warnings about washed-out roads and rising water levels. He should have stayed inside. That is what his son Kevin would have said, what his daughter Amy would have insisted upon. But Henry had spent 4 decades as a park ranger in these mountains, and something in the roar of that flood sounded wrong. Not just water, something else. A high-pitched cry that cut through the thunder and rain, desperate and fading, the kind of sound that grabbed something deep in your chest and would not let go. It had been 4 years since Catherine died. 4 years since cancer had taken his wife of 42 years, leaving him alone in a cabin that felt too big and too quiet. 4 years of his children calling every week, suggesting gently and then not so gently that maybe it was time to sell the cabin, move closer to them in Billings, find one of those nice senior communities with activities and people his own age. 4 years of him saying no, because leaving would mean accepting that the life he had built with Catherine was truly over. Before we continue with Henry's story, we want to invite you to subscribe to Wandering Heart's Tales. Every subscription helps us share more stories about the incredible bonds that change lives in unexpected ways. Your support strengthens our community dedicated to celebrating these extraordinary connections. Please subscribe and join us. Henry pulled on his old park ranger jacket, still hanging by the door where he had left it the day he retired. It was worn at the elbows and faded across the shoulders, but it was waterproof and it smelled faintly of pine sap and wood smoke and Catherine, who used to steal it on cold mornings. He grabbed his walking stick, an emergency kit, and his radio, then stepped out into the deluge. The rain hit him like a physical assault. Within seconds, he was soaked despite the jacket. The temperature had dropped to just above freezing, and the wind drove the rain sideways. Henry squinted against the storm, following that sound. His boots sank into mud with each step, and twice he nearly lost his footing on the slick ground. His knees protested, his back ached, and his breath came in short gasps that turned to white vapor before his face. He should turn back. The rational part of his mind knew this. But rationality had stopped mattering much 4 years ago, when they told him there was nothing more they could do, that he should make Catherine comfortable, that he should say goodbye. He found them 70 yards from his cabin, near the swollen creek, where the willows grew thick. The mother mountain lion lay on her side in the mud, her tawny coat already streaked with rain and blood. Henry had seen enough death in these mountains to recognize it immediately. She had been shot recently, judging by the blood that still seeped from the wound in her side. Poaching. Still illegal, still happening, despite everything Henry and rangers like him had done to protect these cats. The cry came again, weaker now. It came from beneath the mother's body, from a small, tawny shape barely visible against her fur. Henry knelt in the mud, his old joints screaming in protest, and gently moved the mother's front leg. There, barely breathing, was a mountain lion kitten no bigger than a house cat. His eyes were still closed, his spots still visible through his wet fur. He could not have been more than 3 weeks old. As Henry watched, the kitten opened his tiny mouth and let out another weak cry, a sound so pitiful it broke something in Henry's chest. He knew what Catherine would have said. Nature has its balance, Henry. We cannot save them all. That is what she had told him 100 times when they found orphaned fawns or injured hawks. The wild takes care of its own, or it does not. That is how it works. But Catherine had also been the one who stayed up all night with him feeding a baby raccoon whose mother had been hit by a car. She had been the one who cried when they had to let a wounded eagle go, hoping its wing would heal in the wild. She had understood that sometimes some lives were worth the risk. Henry scooped the kitten into his arms, tucking him inside his jacket against his body. The kitten was so cold, too cold. Henry could barely feel him breathing. The walk back to the cabin was the longest of his life. The flood had risen even in those few minutes, and Henry had to wade through ankle-deep water that pulled at his boots. He stumbled twice, catching himself on rocks, his heart pounding with exertion and fear. The kitten did not move against his chest. Henry pressed his hand to the tiny body, feeling for any sign of life, and found only the faintest flutter of a heartbeat. "Hold on," he whispered. "Just hold on." Inside the cabin, Henry went straight to the fireplace. He built up the fire until it roared, filling the room with waves of heat. Then he made a nest of blankets and towels in front of the hearth and carefully laid the kitten down. The little cat was hypothermic and severely dehydrated. His gums were pale, his body limp. Henry grabbed more towels and began rubbing gently, trying to stimulate circulation, trying to warm him slowly so his small system would not go into shock. 20 minutes passed before the kitten finally let out a small whimper and his tiny legs twitched. Henry felt relief flood through him so powerfully he had to sit down. "That's it," he murmured. "That's it, little fighter." He knew he needed to get fluids into the kitten, but he was too young to drink on his own. Mountain lion kittens this age needed their mother's milk, rich and fatty and full of antibodies he would never get. Henry did not have mountain lion milk. He did not even have kitten formula. What he had was some emergency puppy formula that the vet had given him years ago for a rescued coyote pup and a medicine dropper. He warmed the formula carefully, testing it on his wrist the way he had tested bottles for Kevin and Amy decades ago. Then he settled on the floor beside the kitten, lifted his small head, and carefully squeezed a drop of formula onto his tongue. The kitten did not swallow. The formula just sat there. Henry's heart sank, but then the tiny tongue moved, just slightly, and he swallowed. Henry gave him another drop, another swallow. It took an hour to get 3 tablespoons into him, but by the end, the kitten's eyes were moving beneath his closed lids, and his breathing had grown stronger. Henry sat back against the hearth, exhausted. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the fire crackled, and curled in a nest of blankets, a mountain lion kitten who should not be alive continued to breathe. He named him Shadow, because of the way that Cry had shadowed him through the storm, pulling him out into the flood. Because of the way the kitten's presence seemed to shadow the emptiness Catherine had left behind. Because he was alone in the world now, and so was Henry, and maybe they could be shadows of their lost families for each other. That first night was brutal. Henry fed Shadow every 2 hours, warming formula and coaxing him to swallow drop by drop. Between feedings, he kept Shadow warm and monitored his breathing and talked to him in a low, steady voice. He told Shadow about Catherine, about how she had loved these mountains and every creature in them. He told him about Kevin and Amy, who had their own families now in the city and called every Sunday to urge him to leave. He told him about the 42 years he had spent in this cabin with the woman he loved and the 4 years he had spent here alone. Shadow made it through the night. When dawn broke grey and cold with the storm finally passing, he opened his eyes for the first time. They were blue, the pale, cloudy blue of all newborn cats, and they focused on Henry's face with an intensity that took his breath away. "Hello there," Henry whispered. "Welcome to the world." The second night was harder. Shadow cried constantly, a high-pitched wailing that cut straight through Henry's heart. He was calling for his mother, for warmth and safety and milk that tasted right. Henry held him against his chest, feeling the tiny body tremble, and found himself humming old songs. Songs Catherine used to sing while doing dishes, songs from their wedding, songs he had not thought of in years. Shadow quieted eventually, his small head pressed against Henry's neck. By the 3rd day, Shadow was drinking formula more readily, but he was not out of danger yet. Henry called the only person he trusted with the truth. Dr. Sarah Chen had been the local wildlife veterinarian for 25 years and had worked with Henry on countless rescues over the decades. "You have done what, Henry?" Sarah's voice was sharp over the phone. Henry explained. There was a long silence. "Henry, that is illegal. Mountain lions are protected. You cannot just keep a mountain lion kitten. You need to call Fish and Wildlife immediately." "He would have died, Sarah." "Maybe, probably. But that is nature, Henry. You know this. Catherine would have told you the same thing. Catherine died holding my hand, Henry said quietly. She died knowing someone was there. I could not let that kitten die alone in the mud. Another long silence. Then Sarah sighed. I will come by tomorrow. I will bring proper formula and check him over. But Henry, this cannot be permanent. You understand that? A mountain lion is not a pet. He will grow up wild. I know, Henry said, but right now he is just a baby who needs help. Sarah came the next morning with specialized formula, vitamin supplements, and a small heating pad. She examined Shadow carefully, her experienced hands gentle as she checked his heart, lungs, and reflexes. He is strong, she said finally, stronger than he should be given what he has been through. You have done well, Henry. But she gave him a serious look. Call your children. Tell them what you have done, because when this cat is bigger, you will need help, and you will need to make some very difficult decisions. Henry nodded, but he did not call his children. Not yet. He knew what they would say. Kevin would be angry, would say he was being reckless and foolish. Amy would cry and beg him to give Shadow to the authorities. They did not understand. They could not. They had their own families, their own lives full of purpose and meaning. They did not know what it was like to wake up every morning to silence, to cook meals for one, to talk to photographs on the wall. Shadow needed him. For the first time in 4 years, something needed him, and that made all the difference. As the days passed, Shadow grew stronger. His eyes opened fully, revealing the pale blue that would eventually darken to amber. He began to move around more, his tiny legs wobbly but determined. He started to play, pouncing on Henry's shoelaces and batting at the corner of a blanket with his oversized paws. He followed Henry everywhere, crying if Henry left the room even for a moment. At night, he slept curled against Henry's side in bed, his small body warm, his breathing deep and steady. Henry knew this could not last. He knew Sarah was right. He knew Kevin and Amy would be horrified. He knew Shadow would grow into a 150-pound predator with instincts he could not control. But that was future Henry's problem. Present Henry had a mountain lion kitten who needed feeding every 4 hours, who cried when he was lonely, who looked at him with absolute trust in his blue eyes. Present Henry had a reason to get up in the morning. 3 weeks after he found him, Henry was in the kitchen preparing Shadow's formula when he heard a truck on the long gravel driveway. His stomach dropped. He knew that engine. It was Kevin's truck. He could hide Shadow in the bedroom. He could meet Kevin at the door with a smile and an excuse. But what was the point? Kevin would find out eventually. They all would. And Henry was 68 years old. He was done hiding. So when Kevin knocked and let himself in, calling Dad, he found Henry standing in the kitchen with a mountain lion kitten in his arms. The look on Kevin's face would have been funny if Henry's heart was not pounding so hard. Dad, Kevin said slowly, his eyes fixed on Shadow. Dad, what is that? This is Shadow, Henry said calmly. I found him during the flood. His mother was shot. Kevin stared at him, then at Shadow, then back at him. Dad, that is a mountain lion. Yes. You cannot keep a mountain lion. I am not keeping him. I am helping him until he is strong enough to be on his own. Kevin ran his hand through his hair, a gesture so like his mother it made Henry's chest ache. Dad, this is insane. You know this is insane, right? Mountain lions are dangerous. He could hurt you. He will hurt you. And it is illegal. You could get in serious trouble. His mother was shot by poachers, Henry said. He was dying in the mud. Was I supposed to just leave him? Yes. Kevin's voice rose. Yes, Dad, that is exactly what you were supposed to do. Call the authorities. Let them handle it. You are 68 years old and you live alone in the middle of nowhere. What happens when this thing gets bigger? What happens when he decides you look like dinner? He would not. You do not know that. Kevin stepped closer, his expression desperate. Dad, please. Please give him to Fish and Wildlife. Let them take care of him and come back to Billings with me. Amy and I have been talking. There is a great retirement community that just opened. It has a garden, activities, other people. You would not be so alone. I am not alone, Henry said quietly. I have Shadow. "He is a wild animal, Dad. He is not Mom." The words hung in the air between them. Henry felt something crack in his chest. "I know he is not your mother," Henry said finally. "But he needs me, and I need something to take care of. Can you understand that?" They stared at each other across the kitchen. Henry saw the moment Kevin realized he could not win this fight. His shoulders sagged. "I am calling Amy," he said finally, "and I am calling every day. And if that cat does anything to hurt you, I am coming up here with fish and wildlife myself." He left without another word, his tires spitting gravel as he drove away too fast. Henry stood in the doorway, watching him go. Shadow, warm and solid in his arms, let out a small yawn and nuzzled against his shoulder. The first 3 months passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. Shadow grew with shocking speed. His tiny body filled out into a gangly kitten with oversized paws and ears that seemed too large for his head. His eyes darkened from blue to amber, and his spotted coat began to fade toward the solid, tawny color of an adult mountain lion. He was beautiful and wild and completely exhausting. Henry quickly learned that raising a mountain lion was nothing like raising a house cat. Shadow did not just scratch furniture, he destroyed it. 2 chairs, the corner of the couch, 3 rugs. He dug holes under the porch that were big enough to lose a small dog in. He yowled at night, a sound that carried for miles and brought concerned calls from the Johnsons, Henry's nearest neighbors, who lived 3 miles down the road. "Everything okay up there, Henry?" Tom Johnson asked when he called for the 3rd time in a week. "We keep hearing the strangest sounds, almost like a big cat or something." "Just coyotes," Henry lied, watching Shadow disembowel a throw pillow. "They have been bold this year." But the hardest part was feeding him. By 8 weeks, Shadow started refusing the formula, crying for something more substantial. Henry drove into town and bought ground venison and chicken, feeding him raw meat that Shadow devoured with an eagerness that was both fascinating and slightly terrifying. Henry watched those tiny teeth tear into the food, saw the way Shadow's eyes became focused and intent, and understood with a chill that he was not raising a pet, he was raising an apex predator. By 12 weeks, Shadow was the size of a large dog, with powerful shoulders and legs built for climbing. His jaws were strong enough to crack bones. He wanted to play constantly, bringing Henry sticks from the yard, pouncing on him from furniture, once dragging in a rabbit he had killed in the meadow. He was so proud of that rabbit, tail twitching, eyes bright with achievement. Henry had to sit down on the porch and take several deep breaths before he could manage a weak good boy. But there were beautiful moments too. The way Shadow would curl up beside Henry's chair in the evening, his head resting on Henry's foot while he read. The way Shadow learned to recognize his name, ears perking up whenever Henry called. The way he would greet Henry every morning with such enthusiasm, as if Henry had been gone for years instead of just sleeping in the next room. Sarah came by every 2 weeks to check on Shadow and lecture Henry about the inevitable. "He cannot stay, Henry. You know he cannot stay. He is getting bigger. Soon he will be too strong for you to handle." "I am not trying to handle him," Henry would reply. "I am just giving him a safe place to grow." But Sarah was not the only one with concerns. 4 months after Kevin's first visit, Amy made the long drive from Billings. She arrived unannounced on a Saturday afternoon with groceries and a determined expression Henry recognized immediately. "Dad," Amy said, setting the groceries on the counter with more force than necessary, "we need to talk." Shadow, who had been sleeping by the fireplace, raised his head and watched Amy with alert amber eyes. He was nearly 5 months old now, as big as a German shepherd, and his presence filled the small cabin in a way that was impossible to ignore. Amy stared at him. "Oh my God. Kevin said he was big, but I thought he was exaggerating. Dad, that is not a kitten. That is a mountain lion." "His name is Shadow," Henry said mildly. "Would you like some coffee?" "I do not want coffee. I want you to explain what you are thinking. You are 68 years old. You live alone. You have a mountain lion, an actual mountain lion, living in your house." Shadow stood up and padded over to investigate, sniffing cautiously at Amy's jeans. "Dad," Amy backed up against the counter, her eyes wide. "Make him stop. He is just saying hello," Henry said. "Hold out your hand. Let him smell you. I am not holding my hand out to a mountain lion. Then he will just keep being curious." Amy stood frozen for a long moment, then slowly, reluctantly, extended her hand. Shadow sniffed it thoroughly, then gave it a single raspy lick with his tongue and walked back to his spot by the fire. "See," Henry said. "Perfectly safe." Amy looked like she wanted to argue, but something in her expression softened. She watched Shadow for a moment, then looked at her father. "You really love him, do not you?" "Yes." "Why?" Amy's voice was quieter now, almost pleading. "Why are you doing this? Why are you staying in this cabin with a wild animal when you could come to the city, be near us, be safe?" Henry poured 2 cups of coffee and guided his daughter to the kitchen table. They sat together in the afternoon light, and Henry tried to find words for something he barely understood himself. "When your mother died," he began slowly, "I lost my purpose. We had built this life together, this whole world up here in the mountains, and then she was gone. And the world was still here, but it felt empty, like I was just going through motions, waiting for something I could not name." He paused, looking over at Shadow, who was now grooming one of his large paws. "Then I found Shadow, and suddenly I had a reason to get up in the morning. Someone who needed me, someone who depended on me. Dad," Amy's eyes were wet, "Kevin and I need you." "You need me to be safe," Henry corrected gently. "You need me to be where you can check on me, make sure I am okay. And I love you for that, sweetheart. But you do not need me the way Shadow needs me. You have your own lives. Shadow has no one but me." They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee, watching Shadow doze by the fire. Finally, Amy reached across the table and took her father's hand. "Promise me you will be careful," she said. "Promise me you will call if anything goes wrong." "I promise." Amy stayed for dinner. By the time she left, Shadow had won her over too. He brought her his favorite stick and dropped it at her feet, tail twitching hopefully. When she threw it uncertainly, he bounded after it with such joy that Amy laughed, actually laughed, and threw it again. Before she drove away, she hugged Henry tightly and whispered, "He is lucky to have you." But as the months passed and Shadow continued to grow, Henry began to wonder if lucky was the right word. By 7 months old, Shadow was massive, nearly 80 pounds of muscle and bone and sharp teeth. His paws were the size of Henry's palms. His jaws could crack deer bones. He was still gentle with Henry, still affectionate, but Henry could see the wild in him now. The way he would go completely still when he heard elk in the forest, the way his eyes would track hawks overhead, the way he would pace sometimes, restless and agitated, as if something in his blood was calling him to run. The incident with Tom Johnson's goats happened in early fall. Henry had let Shadow out into the fenced yard, thinking he would be safe there. But Shadow cleared the 6-foot fence in a single bound and disappeared into the trees. Henry found him 2 hours later at the Johnsons' place, standing over the body of a young goat, blood on his muzzle. Henry had never been so angry. He dragged Shadow back by his scruff, shouting no and bad, while Shadow looked confused and hurt, not understanding why his natural instinct to hunt was causing such distress. Henry locked Shadow in the cabin and drove to the Johnsons to confess and apologize and offer to pay for the goat and the whole herd if necessary. Tom Johnson was not gracious. "That animal needs to be put down," he said flatly, his face red. "It is a menace. If it killed my goat, what is going to stop it from attacking a person?" "There are no people out here except us," Henry said weakly. "That is not the point. The point is, you have a wild animal you cannot control, and someone is going to get hurt." Henry drove home in silence, knowing Tom was right. He found Shadow pressed against the door, whining anxiously. When Henry let him in, Shadow crawled to him on his belly, ears flat, tail tucked, looking so miserable that Henry's anger evaporated. He sat on the floor, and Shadow put his huge head in Henry's lap, and Henry cried into his fur while Shadow whined softly and tried to lick away the tears. He knew he should call fish and wildlife. He knew he should let them take Shadow to a sanctuary somewhere, but he could not bring himself to make the call. Not yet. Just a little longer. The moment that changed everything came on a cold October afternoon when Shadow was 9 months old. Henry was outside splitting firewood, a chore that was getting harder every year. He did not hear the black bear approaching until Shadow suddenly went rigid. Every muscle in his body tensed, the fur along his spine rising in a dramatic ridge. Henry turned and saw the bear at the edge of his property, perhaps 40 feet away. It was huge, maybe 400 pounds, with small eyes fixed on Henry with unmistakable interest. It was late in the season. The bear should have been fattening up for hibernation, but it looked thin and desperate. Shadow did not hesitate. He placed himself directly between Henry and the bear, and the sound that came from his throat was nothing Henry had ever heard before. It was not a meow or a hiss, but a deep, guttural snarl that seemed to come from the earth itself. His lips pulled back to show all his teeth, and every inch of him radiated lethal intent. The bear kept coming. Shadow exploded forward. What happened next was a blur of tawny fur and black fur, of snarls and roars, and the sickening sound of claws on flesh. The bear was 5 times Shadow's size, but Shadow was fast and fierce and absolutely fearless. He darted in and out, slashing at the bear's face and flanks, never letting the bear get a solid grip on him. When the bear swiped at him with those massive claws, Shadow leapt aside and lunged back in, his teeth finding the bear's shoulder. Henry stood frozen, the axe forgotten in his hands, watching his mountain lion fight a black bear to protect him. He wanted to scream at Shadow to stop, to run, to save himself, but he could not find his voice. He could only watch and pray. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes, though it felt like hours. Finally, bleeding and frustrated, the bear decided this was not worth the effort. It retreated into the woods, leaving Shadow standing in Henry's yard, sides heaving, blood dripping from a gash on his shoulder and scratches on his face. Shadow watched until the bear was completely gone, then turned to Henry and made a soft, chirping sound, as if asking, "Are you okay?" Henry dropped the axe and ran to him, falling to his knees in the dirt and wrapping his arms around Shadow's neck. He was shaking so hard he could barely hold on. Shadow had saved his life. This mountain lion he had pulled from the mud, this creature everyone said would turn on him, had just risked his life to protect him. Sarah came within the hour. She stitched Shadow's wounds while Henry held his head and murmured reassurances. Shadow bore it stoically, only flinching once when Sarah hit a particularly sensitive spot. "He could have been killed," Sarah said quietly when she was done. "That bear could have torn him apart." "But it did not," Henry said. "He protected me." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "I know what you are thinking, Henry. I know you think this proves he is safe, that he will always protect you. But this also proves what I have been telling you. He is wild. He fought a bear. What happens the next time something threatens you? He would not hurt anyone. You do not know that." "Yes," Henry said firmly, "I do." That night, after Sarah left, Henry sat beside Shadow by the fire, one hand resting on his head, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the evidence of the fight, making everything clean and white and new. They had saved each other, Henry realized, in ways that went far beyond the physical, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The first time Shadow heard the call, Henry was reading by the fireplace, and Shadow was dozing at his feet. It was a cold January night, nearly a year since Henry had found him in the flood. Shadow was 14 months old now, fully grown at nearly 100 pounds of solid muscle and sleek tawny fur. He was magnificent. Then the scream drifted through the winter darkness, distant and eerie and wild, another mountain lion. Shadow's head shot up, ears pricked forward with an intensity that made Henry's stomach tighten. Another scream answered the first, a chorus of calls echoing through the mountains. Shadow stood, every muscle quivering, and walked to the door. He looked back at Henry, and in his amber eyes Henry saw something he had been dreading for months. Longing, recognition, the pull of something ancient and undeniable. "Not yet," Henry whispered. "Please, not yet." But Shadow whined and pawed at the door, and Henry knew he could not keep him locked inside. That was not love, that was imprisonment. So he opened the door and watched Shadow disappear into the darkness, following those wild calls that spoke to something in his blood that Henry could never understand. Shadow came back 4 hours later, covered in snow and smelling like pine and musk and something else, something wild. He greeted Henry with his usual affection, pressing his cold nose against Henry's hand. But something had changed. Something had awakened. Over the next few weeks it happened again and again. The calls would come, and Shadow would beg to go out, and Henry would let him. Shadow always came back, sometimes after an hour, sometimes after half the night, but he always came back, until the night he did not. Henry woke at dawn and found Shadow's bed empty. He called for him, standing on the porch in his robe despite the cold, his voice carrying through the trees. No response. He waited all day, trying to stay busy, cleaning things that did not need cleaning, cooking food he did not eat. Night fell. Shadow did not return. The second day was worse. Henry barely slept, starting awake at every sound. Convinced he heard Shadow at the door, he called Sarah, trying to keep the panic from his voice. "How long has he been gone?" Sarah asked gently. 36 hours. "Henry," Sarah said carefully, "you know what this means." "No, he will come back. He always comes back." "But what if he does not? What if he has found other mountain lions? What if he has decided that is where he belongs?" Henry could not answer. He hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table, staring at Shadow's empty food bowl, feeling the familiar hollow ache of loss settling into his chest. Shadow returned on the third day, just after dawn. Henry heard him on the porch and flew to the door. Shadow stood there, thinner and dirtier than Henry had ever seen him. His paws were cut, his coat was matted with burrs and mud, and there was blood on his muzzle that was not his own. "Where have you been?" Henry whispered. Shadow pressed against Henry's legs, chirping softly, and Henry knew. Shadow had been hunting. He had been with other mountain lions. He had been living the life he was born to live. Henry cleaned him up and fed him, and Shadow slept for 18 hours straight. When he woke, he was Henry's Shadow again, affectionate and gentle. But Henry understood now. This was not forever. This was borrowed time. A pattern emerged. Shadow would stay for a week, sometimes 2. Then the call would come, and he would go. 3 days, 4 days, once for nearly a week. Each time he left, Henry's heart broke a little more. Each time he returned, Henry held him a little tighter. Spring came to the mountains, melting the snow and bringing new life to the forest. Shadow's absences grew longer, but his returns were no less joyful. He would burst through the tree line and race to the cabin, and Henry would meet him on the porch, and for a few perfect moments, everything was right in the world. It was on one of those perfect moments in late April that everything changed. Shadow had been gone for 6 days. Henry had spent the time working in his garden, preparing the soil for the vegetables he planted every year. Catherine had always helped with the garden. Now he did it alone, his movements slower, his back protesting, but determined to maintain this small connection to the life they had built together. He was kneeling in the dirt, planting tomato seedlings, when the world suddenly tilted sideways. His right leg went numb, his face felt strange, drooping. He tried to stand, and his body would not cooperate. He fell into the freshly turned soil, confused and frightened, and unable to call for help. A stroke. Even through his confusion, some part of Henry's mind understood what was happening. He tried to drag himself toward the house, but his body would not obey. The left side still worked, but the right side was dead weight. He managed to move perhaps 4 feet before exhaustion overwhelmed him. He lay in his garden, feeling the sun warm on his back, and thought, "This is how it ends, not in my sleep like I hoped, not peacefully, but alone in the dirt, like Catherine warned me it would." He must have passed out, because when awareness returned, the sun had moved and something was nudging his shoulder. Shadow. He had come back. He was pushing at Henry with his nose, whining anxiously, trying to get Henry to respond. Henry tried to speak, but his mouth would not form words. Tried to move, but his body was foreign and unresponsive. Shadows circled him, his whines growing more desperate. He licked Henry's face, his hands, trying to wake him up. When that did not work, he let out a scream, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the mountains. Then he ran. Henry drifted in and out of consciousness. He was dimly aware of time passing, of the sun moving across the sky, of thirst and confusion and fear. Then voices, human voices. Hands on him, gentle and urgent. Sarah's voice, shocked and scared. Shadow must have brought her somehow. Shadow had known to get help. The next few days were a blur of hospital rooms and tests and doctors with serious faces. He had suffered a significant stroke. The right side of his body was partially paralyzed. He would need extensive therapy. Kevin and Amy arrived, tearful and grim, and had the conversation Henry had been dreading. "Dad, you cannot go back to the cabin," Kevin said. "You need round-the-clock care." "No," Henry said clearly, "the speech therapy already showing results. I'm going home." "Dad," Amy pleaded, "you can barely walk. You cannot take care of yourself, let alone a mountain lion." "Shadow saved my life," Henry said. "He got help when I needed it. He is smarter than you think, and I am stronger than you think." It took 3 weeks of intensive therapy, but Henry proved his point. He learned to walk again with a cane. He learned to compensate for the weakness in his right arm. He learned to manage on his own. When Henry finally returned home in mid-May, Shadow was waiting on the porch. He had been staying with Sarah, pacing and anxious. But the moment Henry's car pulled up, Shadow was on his feet, his whole body vibrating with joy. Henry opened the car door, and Shadow rushed to him, pressing against his legs, but careful, so careful, as if he understood Henry was fragile now. Henry ran his good hand through Shadow's fur and cried, and Shadow chirped and licked away his tears. Shadow did not leave again for 2 weeks. He stayed close, following Henry from room to room, sleeping beside his bed at night. When Henry struggled with tasks, Shadow seemed to understand. He learned to bring Henry his cane when needed. He would steady Henry with his solid body when Henry's balance wavered. But eventually, the call came again. Shadow paced by the door, torn between 2 worlds, and Henry, understanding finally what true love required, opened the door. "Go," he said. "I will be here when you come back." Shadow looked at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Henry saw gratitude and guilt and love. Then he ran into the forest. 3 days later, Shadow came back. But he was not alone. Henry was sitting on the porch when he saw them emerge from the tree line, Shadow in front, and behind him, moving cautiously, a beautiful female mountain lion. She was smaller than Shadow, with intelligent eyes and a careful posture. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, unwilling to come closer to the human dwelling. But Shadow bounded up to the porch, tail twitching, and then did something that made Henry's breath catch. He ran back to the female, touched his nose to hers, then returned to Henry. Back and forth, as if trying to bridge 2 worlds, trying to say, "You are both important to me. You are both my family." The female never came up to the porch. But over the next few weeks, Henry would sometimes see her at the tree line when Shadow came to visit. And one morning in early June, Henry woke to find Shadow lying on his porch. Beside him, keeping their distance but undeniably present, were 2 mountain lion kittens. They were about 6 weeks old, their spots still visible, their movements clumsy and curious. They tumbled over each other, play-fighting and exploring, while their mother watched from the forest edge. Shadow watched from the porch, his position carefully chosen. He was the bridge between wild and human, between 2 families he loved. Henry sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. Shadow had not just survived, he had thrived. He had found his place in the wild, had found a mate, had started a family. But he had not forgotten Henry. He had brought them here to show him, to say, "Look what I have become. Look at this life you saved." Over the summer, the visits continued. Shadow would bring his family to the edge of the clearing, never forcing them closer than they were comfortable. The kittens grew bolder over time, venturing a little nearer each visit, though never as close as their father would come. Henry learned their rhythms. If he left meat on the porch edge, the female would take it, but only after Henry had gone inside. The kittens were endlessly curious, especially the smaller one who had Shadow's dark markings around her eyes. Kevin and Amy came to visit in August. When they saw the mountain lion family at the tree line, Kevin was speechless. Amy cried. And Henry, sitting on his porch with his cane beside him and his heart full, said, "I told you, love finds a way." Sarah came by regularly to check on Henry. She admitted she had been wrong about Shadow. This mountain lion could have disappeared completely into the wild, could have chosen to never return. But he kept choosing Henry. He kept bridging those two worlds. On a cool evening in September, Henry sat on his porch and watched Shadow play with his kittens in the clearing. The female, who Henry had started calling Amber in his mind, watched from her usual spot at the tree line. One of the kittens, the brave little female, ventured close to the porch steps, curious about the human scent. Shadow watched carefully but did not stop her. She climbed onto the first step, then the second, her tiny nose twitching. Henry held very still, his heart pounding. The kitten reached the top step and looked up at Henry with eyes that held Shadow's intelligence and curiosity. Slowly, carefully, Henry extended his good hand. The kitten sniffed it cautiously, then gave it a quick raspy lick and bounded away, racing back to her siblings. Shadow's tail twitched, and Henry could have sworn he looked pleased. That night, after the mountain lion family had returned to the forest, Henry sat by his fireplace and looked at Catherine's photograph on the mantel. "I did it, Catherine," he whispered. "I saved him, and I let him go, and he chose to come back. I think you would be proud." Outside, a scream echoed through the mountains, then another and another, a whole family calling to the moon. And in the middle of that wild chorus, Henry heard Shadow's voice, strong and free and joyful. He had raised a mountain lion. He had loved a wild thing. He had learned that the deepest love was not about holding on, but about letting go, about giving roots and wings and trusting in the bond that connected two hearts across impossible distances. As Henry climbed into bed, his body tired but his spirit at peace, he heard Shadow's familiar weight settle on the porch outside his window. He was there. He was safe. He was wild and free and loved. And tomorrow he would run with his family through the mountains, living the life he was meant to live. But tonight he chose to be here, keeping watch over the human who had saved him when he was helpless and small. The man who had taught him that love was not a cage. It was a door that was always open, a welcome that never expired, a home that would always be waiting, no matter how far he roamed or how wild he became. And that, Henry thought as he drifted off to sleep, was the most beautiful kind of love there was.